Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It's good to be back in Reykjavik. It's good to be back at Arctic Circle Assembly. I think this is the 10th time that I have attended. You look around the room, it's hard to see from up here because it's so dark, but the conference can't grow any bigger because we have filled HARPA to capacity. And that's a clear sign of where we are and the attention that is focused on the far north. And I'm pleased that we are seeing with each year an ever-growing delegation from the United States. We have representatives here from our departments of state, from defense, energy, the Coast Guard, the National Science Foundation. We have universities represented, think tanks. We have so many that are gathered here from the United States to be part of this open dialogue about this very important part of our country and our shared interests. Last year, I had an opportunity at this podium to kind of trace the evolution, if you will, of our policies in the United States. And I said on that stage that the United States is finally stepping up as an Arctic nation. And I shared how far that we have actually come over these recent years, how we have seen added investment, how our policies have been refined and expanded, how personnel is policy, and how we're really putting all of those key elements into place. And it's one thing to talk about it, but then it's another to actually see that put in play. And so this year, I'm very, very pleased to be able to report on some of that continued process, and particularly proud to be able to report that a founding member of our U.S. Arctic crew has a new title. So many of you have known Dr. Mike Sfraga over the years, and now you know him as U.S. Ambassador Mike Sfraga. We have now confirmed Mike to be our first ambassador at large for the Arctic affairs. Ambassador Sfraga is here this week. He's already representing the United States with distinction on the world stage. So that is good to be able to put a pin in that particular initiative. We've also been working to build out our Arctic infrastructures. You have heard me say on this stage, we are behind when it comes to what many would expect as basic infrastructure in the Arctic. So pushing out on development of our ports and our airports, an eye towards future commerce and the connections that come. We're continuing to work to build on the connectivity that comes with broadband to ensure that we have water and energy projects to close that divide and help lower the costs in these very remote and rural areas. And we saw many positives over this past year, but it also demonstrated very clearly to me, but to so many others, that the importance of our regional alliances and how those alliances will shape the future of the Arctic as much as anything or anyone. Because even as we are stepping up into our role as an Arctic nation, we are recognizing, look, you can't do this on your own. You can try, but it's pretty hard. You can't do it on your own. And we're realizing that in numerous areas that Arctic leadership, it's important. We are in there, we are leading, but it's not as easy as it sounds, and we are realizing the benefits that these partnerships and alliances can bring. One example is icebreakers. You hear me talk a lot about icebreakers because in the United States we have icebreaker envy. We are working on it, but we are not there. Those of us in Congress have authorized 6 icebreakers. We have fully funded 2. We have provided funding for long lead time materials for a 3rd. Most recently, we signed off on purchasing a commercially available icebreaker that will be home ported in Alaska. That's all great. But our icebreaker program is over budget. It's behind schedule. We have not yet built a single ship. We're already facing delays and overruns. Our commercial icebreaker that we're looking forward to bringing online is going to require significant upgrades as well as shoreside infrastructure before we can really see it at home in the water. Another area, we talk about the connectivity, and we're making some headway. We've got technologies that we are utilizing. We're putting in place Starlink, fiber. We're connecting remote villages, but it's another matter when you're interconnecting nations, and we've got more work to do there. But my point is the regional alliances, this is going to be where it makes a difference, that saving grace. Because our best future isn't America alone, but the Arctic aligned. For icebreakers, we're now talking about what we call the Ice Pact, enabling us to work with Canada and Finland to develop these highly sophisticated ships. For communications, we've got Sweden's KSAT, which is helping to bridge a critical gap by establishing ground stations in Alaska to serve commercial, government, and defense contractors. And we're still doing so much at home. We're continuing to build the icebreakers on our Gulf Coast. We have great satellite launch facilities in Alaska. We've got Poker Flats for rockets. We have Kodiak Spaceport for space launch. We can serve as that test bed for new equipment and platforms to launch them into polar orbits. But we're best served by leaning on one another's strengths to fill these gaps. Because again, I think we all recognize none of us can lead on our own in the Arctic. And this holds true in so many different areas beyond infrastructure, where it's our cooperative efforts in research to better understand the climate impacts from thawing permafrost, from addressing the wildland fires that we are seeing in our northern areas, to dealing with mental health, particularly with our young people in the north. So there's so much that we need to be partnering and working on, these international alliances. But I also want to recognize, and I truly appreciate the Prime Minister's opening comments, because I think it's important that we talk about, or we address a little bit, the elephant in the room, or perhaps in this case, it's the polar bear in the room, and that is our mutual defense in the Arctic. And I know that this isn't typically a forum for defense, but we can't pretend that the future of the Arctic is secure unless we talk about it. National security has forced its way onto the agenda, even here at the Arctic Circle Assembly. We all want this to be a zone of peace. But due to the actions of a few, there is a new chill that is running through the Arctic. We see continued provocations from Russia in Alaska. We see it elsewhere. Russia and China are conducting joint missions in the Arctic, both in the air and on our waters as part of their no limits agreement. We see Russian espionage continuing across the Arctic. Since the last Arctic Assembly alone, when I stood at this podium, U.S. forces have intercepted at least 11 different intrusions of Russian aircraft into the Alaska ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zone. This is more than twice the normal average, but we're hardly alone in this. We saw a Russian warship fired a warning shot at a Norwegian fishing vessel operating in Norway's own EEZ in the Barents Sea. Russian spy networks posing as fishing vessels, hanging around critical infrastructure in the north. An unknown saboteur cut communication cables at Norwegian air bases. Self-described near-Arctic nations are also seeking influence in the region as they see opportunity to exploit resources, whether it's energy or fish or something else, seeking control through investments that often result in more harm than good. And I would hope that we can agree that this isn't good, it's not appreciated, it's not positive for the Arctic, but it's also a reminder that so much of what we are trying to build in the far north depends on an allied defense, which in turn requires a stronger physical presence across participating nations. As watchful as we are about Russia and China, 7 of the 8 Arctic nations are now members of NATO. So if an ice curtain is coming down, not many nations appear eager to place themselves on the wrong side of it. So as we look ahead, it is also important to recognize that every country has a role, no matter their size or their might. I was just last week in Palau. It has deflagged several Russian LNG carriers that were seeking to evade the sanctions that we have placed on them. We need that type of courage and conviction to spread in Europe, to spread across the globe. In Europe particularly, we're seeing Russian seafood continue to fuel Putin's war machine and threaten stability in the Arctic. As I think about where we are today, I think about the words that Winston Churchill said. He said, "Our efforts in the Arctic are at the end of the beginning. What lies ahead is certainly individual nations pulling their own weight, but with a collective approach where cooperation and partnership are the standard for all prosperous, peace-seeking, and rule-abiding nations." So at this time, I have the privilege to do something I've never been able to do before, and that is to introduce another person to the stage. And I would like to introduce the man who will help lead the U.S. in that collective effort with his extraordinary knowledge and understanding of the Arctic and the relationships and the diplomacy that he brings to the region that we call home. So I'd like to introduce to you America's first Ambassador at Large for the Arctic region, Dr. Mike Sfraga. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Senator, for your frank and comprehensive speech. And
you always want frank.
I know.
That was my dad.
Yes, I know. And I also join you in congratulating my friend, our friend, Ambassador Mike Sfraga, on his new appointment. And I think you could witness from the reaction of the hall that your new responsibilities are greeted with great enthusiasm and expectations from this community of partners. So I'm going to open the floor to questions. We all know that you represent the Republican Party in one way or another. And,
actually, most would say that's not an accurate
I know. And so everybody knows, of course, that there are elections in the United States in 3 weeks' time, or less. Mm-hmm. And thank you for making the time to come here to the Assembly. I often point out to people that during the Obama administration, we had the chairship of the Arctic Council being led by the United States, and you had a fascinating ministerial meeting up in Alaska. Then President Trump came, and he decided, or his administration, to open an American mission in Greenland. And he sent his Secretary of Energy to speak here, and of course issued his famous tweet to buying Greenland if it was for sale. And now we have the Biden administration and your own effort in the Senate, establishing and consolidating the Arctic Caucus in the Senate, and changing the international representation of the United States in the way you have described and we have welcomed here. So let me put the first question to both of you. should we expect changes in the Arctic engagement and Arctic policy of the United States depending on who wins the election? Or will the US continue what we have seen as a gradual escalation or enhancement, whatever you want to call it, from Obama through Trump through Biden?
Well, I will start and then turn to the ambassador here. But part of what I have been trying to do, working with colleagues in the Congress, is to make sure that our policies as they relate to the Arctic are not dependent on who occupies the White House, but that they are actually embedded into what we do and how we approach this extraordinary region. It should not be whether or not a president likes or does not like Alaska, but recognizing the significance of this region to not only the United States, but also where we sit in that leadership role globally. And so that has been an effort that has been somewhat systematic. We have made, I think, some significant gains to that, but I think I would be less than honest with you and those that are here that if you have a second Trump administration, his views on climate are very, very different than what you saw in a Biden-Harris administration. And so there would be those pressures that would come from the viewpoints of whether it's Trump or whether it's Harris. What I would like to suggest, though, is that all is not entirely dependent on the occupant of the White House, but that we do have a role in Congress as that separate but equal branch. We just have to assert our own authority, and we need to do that more clearly rather than rubber stamping what comes out of the executive. So it puts the burden on Congress, but I think it's an important burden that we may need to put in place.
Well, I often say American presidents come and go, but senators stay. And you are a good proof of that maxim. Yes. Mike, Ambassador Sfraga, I apologize.
That's all right. Yes. Chairman Grimson. Thank you again for having us, and thank you, friends and colleagues, for the warm welcome. I would echo the Senator's comments in terms of institutionalizing the Arctic in U.S. foreign policy. That's the effort here. If you listen to what the Senator said this year and the year before and the year before and the year before and the year before, the United States, Congress, administrations, I think have realized that the Arctic is very important to the United States. It's a realization. I've been on the stage last year saying that I think we have a Venn diagram of effort that demonstrates that the United States has now a lasting vision for the Arctic. It starts with the National Strategy for the Arctic region, a 10-year strategy led by our good friend, Ambassador Dave Bolton, that will help the United States align itself, yes, to its own interests, but the emphasis on allies and partners, on regional security, to food security, to cooperation and governance around the Arctic. That's a 10-year strategy. And there are a lot of other strategies you'll hear about over the next few days. Our Department of Defense, we have a Department of Energy, we have a Homeland Security, U.S. Coast Guard. I'm not trying to give you a list, I'm trying to give you a vision, is that there's been an effort to institutionalize the efforts of the Arctic throughout the entire U.S. federal government. And I think we've come a long way, but as the Senator noted, we're not there yet. So when we think about changes in administrations, what has been built are organizations, institutions, efforts that I think will stand the test of time no matter which administration is running the White House, our government. You might have different areas of emphasis, but I believe this 10-year portfolio, at least for now, will endure, again, with different emphasis areas.
Well, that's very interesting. So let me open it up to the hall. Yes, there's a question there. Yes. And then another one just behind you. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, I'm Rocky Weitz. I'm Director of the Maritime Studies Program at the Fletcher School. I wanted to ask about the Icebreaker collaboration effort. between the US, Finland, and Canada. How can we really juice that up to take care of our icebreaker problem?
Well, if I remember correctly, the Finns offered to build 3 icebreakers for the price of 1 built in the United States. So let us have a question behind you before I turn it. Oh, yes.
Yeah,
And then another one behind that. Yes, go on.
I'm Esben Joas. I'm a French student here in high school in Iceland. You rightly mentioned the importance of Arctic Circle for the United States, and I was wondering, did the US ambition also to take the lead on the environmental problems we're facing against the Arctic, and if you are ready to collaborate with all the countries on the topic of the environment, like countries like China or Russia also?
Okay, let's have one question behind you there, and then we will take answers and then go back to, yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark Lantain from the Arctic University of Norway, Tromsø. Thank you very much for your comments. Senator Murkowski, you just stated right now the concern about an ice curtain, which is very much a valid one, and also the idea that not too many countries want to be on the other side of it. That said, we are definitely starting to see a pattern of new countries stepping up, identifying themselves as Arctic stakeholders. For example, the BRICS, now the BRICS Plus, the SCO. So we're definitely seeing a more kind of international scope, including some potential US adversaries. So I was wondering how you feel that the US should address this particular issue. Thank you.
Senator.
Let me start with the icebreaker. And how we can juice up this ice pact. I think it is an important idea. I think as President Grimson has said, the Finns have long said, we're the experts here. Now they're into this picture and hopefully being able to share technologies, expertise, workforce. How this all comes together, I think, is still a subject of great debate. The memorandums of understanding, it's my understanding, are being put in place literally as we speak. I don't want this to be just yet one more exercise where we say we're going to cooperate, and it means that we expect everything to come to the United States. You basically deliver your product here, and we are able to say it was built in the States, and we've done it with your blessing. I'm trying to get icebreakers built more quickly, less expensive, and get them into the water. And so I'm not satisfied yet that we have anything more than a cooperative arrangement on paper. So my urgency right now is to be pushing with Coast Guard that I think has a different view than perhaps Homeland does, than perhaps DOD does. And then you bring in Canada and Finland in terms of what their understandings are. I am not satisfied that we have in place what's going to give us the icebreakers that we need in the time frame that we need. Work with me on that. Do you want to take the collaboration?
Sure. I think that, but in regards to juicing up the ice pack, which now I think would be a phrase going out the next, yeah. Thank you, Rocky. I think that I agree with the senator. I mean, it's important. It's a great way to leverage allies and partners, leverage our collective interests and our capacities and our expertise. We all need it, but I think it's one part of our formula to try to get icebreakers in the water for not just the United States, but for all those countries that we work with very closely. So I think it's one piece of a larger pie, but at least we're taking that step. The second on international cooperation on issues related to the environment, it's happening right now. If you look at the seminal work that the Arctic Council does, that's what they have been doing. The working groups now at the technical level still working. Think about research institutions around the circumpolar north. A lot of work, researcher to researcher, institution to institution. Dr. Holdren just noted his work with the institutions in China. I mean, it's happening, and it happens at the federal level, and it happens at the researcher level, and it happens at the institution level. My former position as the U.S. chair of the Arctic Research Commission, We watch that every day and enable that every day. International collaboration is the key to solving the problems, adaptation, mitigation, helping communities. That's what we do. If you want a beacon, look at the National Science Foundation and the work they do all over the world. So I would say it's happening. Can we do more? Absolutely. Should we do more? Yes.
And then the last question about the collaboration, even with countries like Russia and China. There's no secret in this room that when a nation crosses into another nation to occupy and to take land, Russia into Ukraine, there are consequences to that. And this is why we have seen the ability of the Arctic Council, which once was a very unified body as only it can be when you have countries of many different interests coming together under one council, why that has been so challenged since Russia invaded Ukraine. We didn't cut Russia out of the Arctic Council. They did it on their own because of their aggressive provocation and the war that they brought to Ukraine. There are consequences to that. There are sanctions that must go with that. And that means that cooperation and collaboration, in many, many cases, has to be completely off the table. Because we just can't turn our eye and say what you're doing is bad over here, but let's keep working together over here. It compromises our science. I think we recognize that, and that's hard. That's hard because we need to have that combined data and that sharing. But when we talk about collaboration and cooperation with a country that has advanced a war on another democratic country, there are consequences to that. And those countries then that aid them in that by helping them evade sanctions, there are consequences to that as well. And so I think it has to be clear that when we talk about cooperation and collaboration, we do it with eyes wide open, that we work with those allies with an understanding, but that those who have crossed the line, as Russia has crossed the line, that it is a different conversation then.
I mean, it just can't be business as usual. I mean, that's been our line. It just can't be.
So as we see here, we are already running over time, but I will take one question there close to the door. Yes.
Hi, thank you. The United States has a particularly violent history with indigenous communities. And as the United States becomes more involved in the Arctic, and as you said, institutionalizing it into our foreign policy, how will you build trust and communication with these communities that are particularly important stakeholders when talking about the Arctic ecosystems?
It is a very relevant question for us in Alaska and across the country. I was actually at an apology ceremony 2 weeks ago in the small village of Cake, Alaska, in southeastern Alaska. 150 years ago, the U.S. Navy bombed that small native village as a consequence of a misunderstanding. But they not only bombed the village, they burned it, they burned all the canoes, they burned the food supplies, and the community, this all happened in January, were left without shelter, were left with no stocks of food. Elders and children perished. It took 150 years to get the U.S. government, the Navy, to apologize to that village. Next week, on October 26th, I'm going to be going to a second small village, the village of Angoon, that was similarly bombed and burned by the U.S. Navy a century ago. Some will say that 100 years to issue an apology is unacceptable. It is. But what is even more unacceptable is never issuing that apology, never allowing these people who for 7 generations have dealt with a trauma that they have carried forward. In accepting the apology, the people of the village of Cake said, now we can begin to heal. We need to do that as a government when it comes to really atrocities like that. What we saw with a boarding school policy by our country that was one of assimilation, trying to literally wipe out the indigenous spirit, the culture of those Native children. And we are now embarking on a mission. This is something that I have led along with Senator Elizabeth Warren, working to establish a commission to look specifically into that policy and to address and to amend how you say that that was wrong. That's where it starts. What we're doing currently with the initiative that I led with a colleague from Nevada, Senator Cortez Masto, and Senator Heidi Heitkamp from North Dakota, to focus on missing, murdered indigenous women who have suffered levels of violence, murder, and then no follow through with our justice system to address that. So your question is very relevant, it's very pertinent, and we are working to address the multiple layers of violence that we have seen directed towards our Native peoples in Alaska. I want to acknowledge the work of the Canadians because it was their efforts that really shone the light initially on what we saw with murdered, missing indigenous women. We have followed that model. The boarding school, very much the same. These were things that our government engaged in, practices that our governments engaged in that were never acceptable. And so how we address them, even though it is decades and perhaps a century later, we have to make that acknowledgement. So thank you for the question.
Well, thank you, Senator, indeed. And thank you, Ambassador. Congratulations. Wish you well in your new endeavor. And now, unfortunately, we are well over our time allotted here. But following this, we will welcome the Foreign Minister of Greenland to the States to present the new policy of Greenland. And referring to the question to me before about the role of indigenous people and voices in the Arctic Circle Assembly, I hope you all understand it as a message that following the United States and China, the Foreign Minister of Greenland takes the States. Thank you.